I'm James McGrath-Wright. I'm a member of the Open Society Institute board here in Baltimore, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for this special conversation. I served on the State Board of Education as the president of that board for 4 years, a total of 8 years on that board, and we did a lot of in partnership with OSI. So I'm excited to be here and honored to present to elite leaders in the field of education policy. I think you're in for a real treat because they're structured as a conversation tonight. Open Society has been in Baltimore for 20 years, and from the beginning, education has been a core area of focus. In particular, we have focused on eliminating obstacles that keep young people from succeeding in and out of the classroom. That work has included a wide range of approaches, including launching the Baltimore Urban Debate League to help students advocate in their own voices and develop leadership skills. Social work is training, Many of you are aware of OSI's efforts to help provide city schools discipline rules and practices, which led to a drop in suspensions from 26,000 in 2004 to 6,800 last year. OSI and its grantees have also worked with the State Department of Education to revise rules and practices so that all districts in the state would produce similar reductions in suspensions. We've led the push to promote restorative practices in Baltimore City Public Schools. So far, 32 schools have begun to integrate restorative practices, and 20 more will begin that work next year. We've also worked with the school police to clarify officers' roles and responsibilities and to support preparation for all officers in restorative responses to conflict, which has reduced school-based arrests by 74% over 3 years. Currently, the Positive School Center, a collaboration between OSI and the University of Maryland School of Social Work, is training educators in cultural responsiveness and trauma-informed care, and it has begun working with city schools on a district-wide racial equity policy. At the same time, OSI and grantees, including ACLU, the NAACP Legal and Education Defense Fund, Advocates for Children and Youth, and Baltimore Algebra Project, as well as others, have steadfastly demanded equitable funding for Baltimore City schools, including the implementation of the Curran Commission's recommendations. OSI has recognized from its founding that the effects of race and racism must be recognized in all of our work, from education to criminal and juvenile justice, addiction and health equity, and fellowship programs. Dismantling racist structures is the imperative that unites our programs. To help more people in the region understand the enormous role that racial discrimination played in our history and continues to play in policy debates, we started the Talking About Race series 10 years ago. I want to take a moment to thank John Meyerhoff and Linnell Strokey Meyerhoff and Vernon and Lillian Reed for their generous support, which has made this series possible. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome a true visionary in the field, Dr. Beverly Tatum. Dr. Tatum is a psychologist, educator, and author who served as president of Spelman College, the oldest historically black women's college in the United States. Woo! From 2002 to 2015. In 1997, Dr. Tatum wrote the landmark book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, in which she challenges Americans' unwillingness to have frank conversations about race, particularly as they relate to young people, and to consider the psychological effects of racial identity development. Dr. Tatum recently published a 20th anniversary edition of the book in which she explores the impact of changing demographics, persistent school and neighborhood segregation, the affirmative action backlash, the election of Barack Obama and subsequent so-called post-racial narratives, the emergence of Black Lives Matter, and the early days of the Trump administration. It is truly a landmark book. If you haven't read it, I urge you to do so. Copies will be available for sale in the lobby, and Dr. Tatum has graciously agreed to sign copies after the event. Joining her tonight in conversation is Dr. Sonja Santelises, the Chief Executive Officer of Baltimore City Public Schools. Dr. Santelises serves as the Chief Academic Officer of City Schools under CEO Dr. Andres Alonso, who had been her classmate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Since becoming CEO in 2016, she has made tremendous strides in leading the district to provide world-class education for Baltimore's children. OSI has been a proud partner with Dr. Santelises on a host of initiatives, including the school system's Blueprint for Success, which is credited with helping to increase graduation rates and reduce dropout rates, among other things. Without further delay, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Sonja Santelises and Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Great. Well, can everybody hear okay? Yes. The mics are on? So I actually want to take the privilege of just starting and saying, one, to actually even be named in the same breath. But Dr. Beverly Tatum, for me, was worth the price of admission. Two, I want to thank OSI for sponsoring this kind of event and this talk. And it is very in line with how OSI has supported Baltimore and Baltimore schools for a long time. I will also say a big thank you to a number of Baltimore City Public School board members who are also here tonight for their support. As we get started, I want to say of Dr. Tatum, because it's easy for me to get starstruck too. A lot of folks who are in city schools who've seen me don't think that happens. And I want you to know it happens to me too. And I will say that in the first kind of 15 minutes of talking with Dr. Tatum, one of the things that became very clear is, as Karen Endor-Weber told me, she is so easy to talk to. And so I'm looking forward to having this conversation. We're looking forward to the questions. I also, so that you know, gave a very personal thank you to Dr. Tatum as I was completing my doctoral study and was looking for someone whose work and scholarship that I could reference, who really understood this idea of race and identity, particularly for students of color and Black students in particular. I remember the time being in the library when someone referred me to, quote, at that time, a new book that went on to really be a landmark study. So personal thanks there. I've got my starstruckness out. Now we'll get to you all in the conversation. And if you could, given that this is the anniversary, the 20th anniversary, talk a little bit about what you think are the biggest changes that have occurred from when you first wrote the book to now. There's a lot that's gone on. Just talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying thank you for being here with me. I'm delighted to be here with all of you and looking forward to this conversation. And I want to thank OSI for making it possible. So here we all are. I am often asked, so what's different, right? Besides it's 100 pages longer, right, than the last version. But when I think about what's changed in our society, there's lots that I could say, but I'm going to distill it down to what I call the 3 Ps. The first P is population. So 20 years ago, the new version came out in 2017. So if we go back to 1997 when the first version came out, the diversity that exists in our U.S. population today was not nearly then what it is today. And if we go back more than 20 years, if we just think about the change in my own lifetime, so I don't mind telling people that I was born in 1954. So being born in 1954, I was born at a time when the U.S. population was 90% white. So I bet I'm not the only 50s baby in the room. Raise your hand if you remember being alive in 1950-something. There are a few of us. You might not remember much about it. So think about that. In 1950, if we were drawing a pie chart, all but one little 10% slice would represent the white population. That 10% slice would represent everybody else. Today, if we were drawing that pie chart, the white population would be about 2/3, 67%. And the Latinx population now is about 18%. The African American population about 13%. The Asian American population about 6%. And that's the fastest growing segment of our population. And Native Americans, maybe somewhere between 1% and 2%. But this is to say that's a big shift, right? And even in 1997, those statistics weren't quite what they are today. So the population's changed a lot, and that means that when we talk about racism in our society, we have to really be thinking intentionally not just about the African American experience, but the broader population of color, because there are a lot of representatives who are also encountering racism in our society, though I think it is important to acknowledge the particularly virulent nature of anti-Black racism. Having said that, so that's the P, first P, population. Second change is politics. And what do I mean by that? When I was thinking about this dimension of, some of the things that have changed, and we think about the change in presidential leadership over the last 20 years. In 1997, when my book came out the first time, the president was Bill Clinton. One of the things that Bill Clinton did, not everybody remembers this, but he launched the Presidential Initiative on Race. Does anybody remember that? A few people do. So he launched this Presidential Initiative on Race. And he launched it in the fall of 1997, coincidentally the same time when the first version of my book came out. And who knew? He read my book. And so he read my book, and he hosted a town hall meeting in Akron, Ohio, to kick off his Presidential Initiative on Race. And he invited a few authors to come, and I was one of the ones invited. So I was in the room, and it was a big auditorium, and we were up on the stage with some, sort of local community representatives, about 60 people from the Akron community and a handful of authors. And President Clinton gave a speech. And in that speech, he talked about why now was the time for the nation to focus on its legacy of racism and try to do something about it. And he said it was important, it was a good time because the economy was strong and we weren't fighting anybody. We were a nation at peace. And so he said, we're a nation at peace, the economy is strong. It's when things are going well that you can really take up the hard questions. And so we should seize this moment of, relative happiness and try to focus on racism. So that was presidential leadership in 1997. I find that a lot of people don't remember that Presidential Initiative on Race, and the main reason they don't is Monica Lewinsky. Because right after he launched, like within a month, after he launched his Presidential Initiative on Race, that scandal broke, and then the news was all about that, and was he going to be impeached and all of that. And very little media coverage of the year-long initiative. But fast forward to the next president, George W. Bush, the son, right? So George W. became president and in 2000, and in 2001, we had 9/11. So, of course, major national trauma, not at peace after that. And then in 2008, still during the George Bush era, at the tail end of it, the economy collapsed. So now, nation at war and an economy in shambles. And so that's not a time people want to take up hard topics. Everybody's just inwardly focused. Fast forward to 2008, we have the election of President Barack Obama, president number 3 in this story. And with the election of President Barack Obama, of course, it was very exciting to see the first African-American Black man to be elected president. But shortly after he was elected, people said, we're post-racial, we don't have to talk about it, right? And so then the conversation was like, no, we don't need to talk about race. And if you want to talk about it, it's because you're racist, right? That was sort of the narrative associated with with his legacy. And then fast forward 2016, and I hope you heard all those things. 2016, of course, we know that our current president was elected, Donald Trump, and much of his rhetoric was certainly in line with white supremacist ideology. So that's a whole another set of conversations about the impact of that kind of leadership. So what we can see is that if we just look at the narrative about race, the change that took place over that 20-year period. And then the last P of the 3 Ps is polarization. We are very much more polarized today, I think, than we were in 1997.
So what's really interesting about that retrospective that you just gave is it has meant that the conversations about race, right, have had to evolve or to keep pace with it. What specifically did you find when you were writing this edition of the book that you felt was most important to highlight in light of that shift that you just took us through?
Well, the sad news is that even though, I laid out that those leadership shifts, the reality is that if we were to chart our course, there was forward movement in the 90s. There's been backward movement in the 21st century, the election of Barack Obama notwithstanding. The most disturbing among them, there's lots that's disturbing, let me just say that. But, I know that if we think about education, we can talk about the persistent and increasing school segregation.
That's right.
2019 marks the 65th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Schools are more segregated today than they were 30 years ago. We could talk about why that is, but that's a fact. But I was also thinking about things like the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I live in Georgia, and I grew up in Massachusetts, but I now live in Georgia, and the removal in 2013 of the protections that the Voting Rights Act provided are clearly visible in Georgia, but not just in Georgia, really across the state, across the nation. There are examples of laws that are clearly intended to suppress the voting rights, particularly of people of color, and that, I think, is really outrageous. For people who are wondering, well, what happened in 2013? There was a Supreme Court decision that basically said, one of the most powerful dimensions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was that states with a history of interfering with people's right to vote had to seek court permission, judicial permission, before they made any changes in their voting laws, to be sure that they weren't, up to their old tricks. And so in 2013, there was a case based in Texas that came forward and said, we have been under court supervision all this time and have been behaving ourselves, basically. And it's a burden to have to keep going back and asking for permission every time we want to make changes, and surely we shouldn't have to still have supervision now. And the court agreed and said, you don't have to have supervision. And as soon as that, if there's a problem, you can seek relief through the courts, but you don't have to get permission before you create the problem.
What's interesting about that trajectory within the voting rights is that there was a similar erosion, right?
Yes.
Within education.
The same process. Yes. So that brings us to Brown versus Board of Education. Right. People often ask, well, how is it possible that 65 years after that landmark decision, schools are as segregated as they are? And there are two answers to that question. One is white flight, right? In those communities where school desegregation was implemented, white people not wanting to participate left those districts or went to private schools and Boston. I grew up in Massachusetts, and anybody old enough to remember the 60s will remember how violent school desegregation.
Well, just so that you know, having been born in 1967, the piece I remember, I don't remember 1967, but I do remember the stories of my grandfather, who was in Georgia, calling and being very upset about me getting ready to go to school because all he saw was the violence in Boston.
From Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yes. So well,
that's right.
In 1967, I was in high school, and I remember the nightly news, seeing all of that. But here's the thing. When school desegregation and busing started in Boston, there were 59,000 white students enrolled in Boston public schools. 20 years later, that number was 9,000. 50,000 kids left. And so that's one reason. Yeah. But another reason has to do with the courts. Right? So one key court decision was in 1974, and that was Milligan versus Bradley. That was basically a Detroit-based case, Michigan, and the question was, if you've got a city, an inner city that's largely black, and you want to desegregate those schools, the only way to do it is to bus kids across district lines. You know, get some kids from the suburbs and bus those kids across district lines. And of course, now let me just say, it's not an accident that the inner city is black, right, and that the suburbs are all white, because there have been racial covenants and housing practices that keep people out of those suburbs. So we can't talk about school segregation without also talking about residential segregation. But if that's the reality, and you're wanting to desegregate the schools, back in the 70s, the strategy was use busing. And the courts ruled that you could not bus across district lines. So if you can't, require busing across district lines. So if you can't move kids across district lines, then essentially you don't have the white kids you need to desegregate the schools. That was one decision. But fast forward, 20 years, another decision which is very similar to the Voting Rights Act decision was the Oklahoma decision. Yes. Yep. And so if you're wondering, what was the Oklahoma decision? So Oklahoma City had very segregated schools for much the same reason. Residential segregation, well entrenched, and segregated schools going back to the early part of the 20th century. And when Brown versus Board happened, there was some attempt to desegregate, but same kinds of things. Lots of resistance, a lot of community resistance. And but then a plan was put in place. They were ordered to put a plan in place, court ordered, and they put a plan in place. But after the plan had been in place for 20 years, still under court supervision, they went to the courts and said, surely we don't need court supervision anymore.
Very similarly to the Voting Rights Act.
We've been behaving ourselves,
That's right. That's right.
And then the court said, yes, good job. You have eliminated, a unitary. You used to have a dual system of schools. Now you just have one system that everybody's participating in. No more court supervision for you. And as soon as the court supervision was gone, they went back to neighborhood schooling. Neighborhood schooling is, by definition, segregated schooling because the neighborhoods are segregated. So then there was another case. The same plaintiffs who brought the case against Oklahoma brought it back again to say, you told them they didn't need supervision, but look what they're doing. And they brought it back, and that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court kicked it back to the district level, and the conclusion was, no supervision required.
That's right.
And as a consequence, you find that decision didn't just affect Oklahoma, it affected every district. No district has to have, if they can demonstrate that they are no longer operating two separate systems, they don't have to have court supervision. So all across the country, you found people going back to neighborhood schooling or neighborhood districting with the same result. And then the last decision I want to mention in this story is the Seattle decision, which was in the 2000s, I want to say 2007. And that was what some schools did. They said, okay, we can't do busing. We've got neighborhoods segregated. but how about if we make magnet schools? How about if we put a special program in this community that will draw people from all over the city into that one school, and that's how we'll mix everybody up, because everybody will want this special arts program or this special STEM program. And but in order for that to really work, you have to, if you really want a well-diversified school district or school program, you have to count how many of these, how many of those, right? You have to keep track. And what happened in Seattle was someone, a white family, who wanted their kid to be in the program and didn't get their kid in, sued and said it's not fair that our daughter can't go to this school that we want her to go to because you're saving spots for kids of color. And they took their case to court, and it went to the Supreme Court. And the question was, can districts legally say that we're going to have X number of these students, X number of those students? Can they use quotas or affirmative action or, can they count?
Yes.
Yeah, can they count? And the court said there will be no counting. But if you can't count, you can't, it's like telling somebody, I want you to lose weight, but never weigh yourself. Right? Well, because if you're not keeping track, how will you know if you're making progress or not?
So one of the things that's interesting in how this plays out, right, within kind of modern school systems like Baltimore City is this question about the impact of segregation, right? So there are those who would say just, integration as a goal, right, is not sufficient. And that actually having majority Black schools or majority schools with children of color should also be able to be excellent schools, right? So some of the debate around does just the presence of white children, right, in a school, the counting, actually lead towards better outcomes. And so, like, one of the questions for me is what have you found about the impact of segregation, particularly on students of color and Black children in particular?
So I think there's at least two things to say about that question. The first part is, let's look at it historically, right? When those parents in Brown versus Board of Education brought that case, they weren't necessarily saying, we want our kid to sit next to a white kid. What they were saying is, we want our kid to have access to the same resources, right? The same, and if you look at the differences then and now, because we still have inequitable funding across most places rely on property taxes, and if you live in a poor neighborhood, there's very little tax revenue. If you live in a wealthy neighborhood, there's more tax revenue. And so because that's how schools are typically funded, you still see great inequities. But if you go back to the 50s, you have schools that the white school had science labs, the Black schools didn't. Or if they had a science lab, there's one microscope for everybody, and one microscope per 10 kids in the white school. These were the kinds of discrepancies, great discrepancies. Used textbooks only for the Black kids, the ones that had been discarded by the white schools when they were out of date or too crummy to be used, got sent to the Black schools. So that kind of inequitable resource was what was really the driver. But there was also the argument that if you tell a population of children, you can't go to that school because you aren't worthy, that is also a very negative message. Now, if we fast forward to today, to the 21st century, we don't necessarily say you can't go to that school because you're not worthy. We don't have that kind of legalized segregation. But if the default position is you're stuck in this school that doesn't have these resources,
That's
right? The resource issue is still the question. And so when people say, do you need to go to school with white children, in a white-dominated, white supremacist society, what still happens is that the resources follow the white kids. So that the logic is still operating, right, in that way. Now, having said that, we live in the 21st century, and if you are going to be an effective leader in the 21st century. And by that, I'm not talking about you and me. I'm talking about the next generation of young people growing up. If you are going to grow up in a society that is increasingly diverse, and in today's world, right, in public education today, that kindergarten class, that first grade class, that second grade class, across the nation, if you look at all those kids across the nation, 50% or more are children of color. If you don't know how to engage with people of color, you are going to be a social dinosaur. Yeah. And so the downside for white children who are racially isolated, and it's important to say that the most, people always ask, why are the black kids sitting together? Yeah. As though they're isolating themselves. The most racially isolated group in the United States are white people. And if you are racially isolated and therefore don't learn how to engage with people different from yourself, that puts you at a disadvantage. Now, the same thing, there's a disadvantage for the kids, the Black and Latinx kids who are socially isolated, not from each other, but typically in schools that are majority, minority, as they're described, are often schools also in which there is concentrated poverty. And we know that any school that has concentrated poverty has more challenges because it's a challenging thing to grow up in a very poor environment. It's hard to focus on learning if you're hungry. It's hard to focus on learning if you're in a traumatized circumstance, if you're homeless, if you're not sure where you're going to be sleeping tomorrow. And when you have kids, a lot of them, all in one place, who are distracted by those kinds of concerns, it makes it hard for anyone who's in that classroom to concentrate.
So you know what, I'm going to take that block that you just said, and I'm going to play it at the next meeting at the legislative session. Right? What is the impact of concentrated poverty? So that's a bonus prize for me. One of the other pieces that's also associated with high levels of concentration of poverty, but is also received so much attention in the time since you wrote the first edition of the book, is a real highlighting, and I would think many of us would agree long overdue, highlighting of the impact of mass incarceration.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about how you are seeing or how you discuss or some of the connections you're making in your book and the real need to push on a system of mass incarceration, particularly for brown and black people in this country.
Sure. Well, if we think about it from a child's point of view, one of the major consequences of mass incarceration is the number of children who are deprived of their parents, right? So if if your father or increasingly your mother, because we often hear about, the focus on black men in prison, and certainly there are high rates of imprisonment, but also the rates of black female imprisonment are rising rapidly. And, so if you're a kid whose parents are in prison, that in itself is trauma for you in terms of, the stability of your family, who's taking care of you. Maybe you've got a grandparent who can provide that love and nurture, but maybe you don't. Or maybe your situation is quite unstable as a consequence. There are lots of things from that point of view. The other side of it is that if the societal expectation, we often hear the statistic, 1 in 3 black men under the age of 25, is in the supervision of the court system, either in prison or on parole or something like that. If you grow up in an environment where that is the expectation for a significant portion of your cohort, what does that do in terms of how you think about your future and what's possible for you? So, there's the psychological dimension, there's the sociological dimension, the talent that is removed from a community. And then, the expert on this, of course, is Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, which I cite quite a bit in my book. But, once you have a criminal record, it's not just that you went to prison, but now can you get housing? Can you get a job? Can you vote? Some places you can't. So the long-term implications it just eats away at the fabric of the community. But I want to tell you something that I learned just recently. It was quite disturbing to me. Earlier, today is Monday, so last week on Friday, I think it was, actually, I was at an event in Atlanta where I heard a scholar from Yale speaking about implicit bias and preschoolers. And it was, this is Dr. Walter Gillum, who is, very much focused on this. And he put up a chart, which I took a picture of with my phone, one of those screenshots. He took a picture where the percentage of black male preschoolers being suspended relative to the total population was the same percentage as going to prison. I mean, it was like, here's the one bar, and then there's another bar, and they were the same height. And so it was really disturbing to see that. And then he talked about, in his research, he talked about that he's been studying sort of what are the precursors to being suspended from preschool. Keep in mind, preschoolers are, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. What are the precursors? And, what's associated? Well, what's associated is being big, right? If you're a big 4-year-old, and I was the mother of a big 4-year-old, right? I have 2 sons, and my youngest son is about 6'3". And when you're 6'3", let's say 6'4" for ease of math. When you're 6'4" as an adult, that means you're 3 feet 2 inches as a 2-year-old. That's a big 2-year-old, right? You are 50% of your adult height at the age of 2. So let's say you're going to be 6 feet tall. You're a 3 foot 2-year-old, and now you are in a preschool with some kids who are only going to be 5 feet, and that means they're 2.5 feet tall, right? You're towering over those kids, 6 inches taller. So if you're 6 inches taller and you lose your temper, you look dangerous, right? Relative to that little 2.5 foot person, right? Yeah. So being big as a preschooler puts you at risk. Being black as a preschooler puts you at risk. And being male as a preschooler puts you at risk. So if you're big, black, and a boy, you are really at great risk. Yes. But there were some other things that they studied that they found related to this preschool suspension thing that didn't have anything to do with the kids. It had to do with the teachers, right? And you might say, oh, well, is it the race of the teachers? No, that's not what I'm talking about. Is the teacher-student ratio high? Like if it's 12 kids or more, you're more likely to be suspended than if it's 8 kids. Oh, interesting. Right? Yeah. And why? I mean, that makes sense because if you've got a lot of kids, you can't tolerate one that's acting up, right? Because you're trying, and if you are, I'm not going to remember all the factors, but I remember the size ratio. And the other factor was if you are stressed.
Well, and I was actually going to bring up the trauma indicator.
Yeah, right? No, the stress of the teacher.
Oh, the stress of the teacher. Okay. So, but what's interesting about that is if you take the stress of the teacher, you take untreated trauma, right, and add that to those other 3 indicators, you have Baltimore's disproportionate suspension in pre-K.
So a low-stress teacher is less likely to suspend. A high-stress teacher under a lot of stress is more likely to suspend. So if you're a stressed teacher with a lot of kids in your class, and those kids are challenged by trauma, and there's little other support, you're going to have more suspension. But what's important there is none of that has to do with except for the trauma part. All that's about the teacher. It's not about the kid, right? Yes. But it was really fascinating. I just want to say one more thing about this. It was really fascinating to hear Dr. Gillum's presentation because he showed a little video. And in the video, there was a scene where 4 children are sitting at a round table like this, playing with Play-Doh. Now, you would think you were observing some preschoolers, but these were actually kid actors, right? I mean, they were young, but they were hired to sit at the table and play with their Play-Doh, right? And the experiment was to see who do the teachers watch. And how did they know? It was very sophisticated because the teachers are looking on a screen, watching the kids play with their Play-Doh, and there's something on the computer they're using that tracks the eye movement. So using this eye tracking movement, they could see that the teacher spent way more time watching the black boy. It was like a black boy, black girl, white boy, white girl. And the kids aren't doing anything. They're just playing with their Play-Doh. They've been told, just play with your Play-Doh. No fights about to break out or anything, right? But the teachers are tracking. They keep looking back and forth, and they spend way much more time. You could see that a little yellow dot would appear every time their eye movement went toward a kid. And the little black kid had these little yellow dots all over him, right? Because and I thought of it when I was comparing that to mass incarceration, the over-policing, right? Yes. You know, the stop and frisk, the over-policing of young black males was exactly like the over-tracking, you know.
That's fascinating.
It was fascinating.
But
so it speaks to just how early racism intrudes into the lives of these children.
And from the perspective of a psychologist,
yes,
what do you see as, I mean, you know, as a school district, we, you know, work on how do you interrupt some of those patterns. But from a psychologist perspective, what do you see as kind of the major levers now, either in kind of small settings in terms of education or even in large initiatives that you think interrupt most effectively some of that implicit bias that's at work?
I think talking about it, for one, is really important, you know, making the unconscious conscious. So if I know that I am, and when I say I'm assuming the role of a teacher, because it wasn't just white teachers, actually black teachers also.
Can you say that again?
Yes, it wasn't just the white teachers. It was black teachers also over-tracking, right? And I often say that the negative stereotypes, the misinformation in our society that gets projected onto people doesn't just get projected by the dominant group. It gets internalized and projected by those who are the subject of the targeting as well. So anyway, all of this is to say, if we can talk about it and bring it into consciousness, then we can think about, you know, am I over-tracking? You know, if I know that I'm more likely to intervene when it's a bigger child, am I being fair to that bigger child? What was the trigger? You know, if that kid got mad, you know, if Tommy hit David, well, did David hit Tommy before when I wasn't watching? Do you know what I mean? You know, is there something, you know, what is the dynamic? And paying attention to that in ways to just become more conscious. Earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time doing professional development with teachers in Massachusetts mostly. And one of the things that I learned in that process was that in this context, most of the teachers were white, but they were working in racially mixed settings. And there was a disparity in performance between the kids of color, particularly African American and Latinx kids, and the white students. And when you talked to the teachers about classroom dynamics, you would often hear things that were problematic. I'll give an example. Black kid is not turning in his homework. And so what's the teacher doing about that? Well, telling him to turn in his homework, of course, but But when the white kid doesn't turn in his homework, the teacher calls the parent. And so, well, how come you didn't call the black kid's parent? Well, I am imagining that parent is working and maybe not available, and, I didn't want to burn, you know what I mean, that there's a different approach. Or I was afraid that if I called the parent would think I was singling out her child and might accuse me of being racially biased. And therefore, I didn't want to make that call. So, in my conversation, I would say, well, if you don't call, you are being racially biased, right? Because you are giving that white kid's parent a chance to partner with you and get the kid in line, right? If that black parent doesn't hear from you, then you are withholding information that that parent needs. And that is treating that kid differently. And then, but what if she calls me a racist? So let's have that conversation. Right. What if she calls me a racist? Well, what if she does? What would happen? I would feel terrible. Okay. And and then what would happen? This is the therapist in me. And then what would happen?
I clearly need some psychological training.
And then what would happen? Well, I would feel terrible. I would feel like I'd been punched in the gut. A teacher said this to me. I'd feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. And I said, well, what would you say? Well, I'd say, well, I'm not racist. I defend myself. And I said, I have another suggestion. My advice is, if someone says you're racist, ask them, why do you think so? If you tell me I'm engaging in some horrible behavior I don't think I'm engaging in, and you said, I really think that was homophobic, that thing you just did, and I don't think so, I would say, tell me why you thought so. What was it that I did that gave you that impression? And then you might say, what was that joke you told? Or whatever. And then I'd say, you're right? I shouldn't have told that joke. Or that was insensitive of me. Or, I didn't think it was offensive, but now that we're talking about it, I can see that, you know what I mean? We could have that conversation. But if I tell you, not possible, not a prejudiced bone of any kind in my body, I'm going to say, if I'm you, check again. Because we all breathe in that smog. In my book, I talked about the fact that misinformation, that's part of the culture, those stereotypes, those images, it's like breathing smog. If you breathe some in, you're going to breathe some out. Whether you want to or not, it's just going to come out. And so when someone calls you on it, you need to say, thank you for telling me.
Well, and it's interesting because you use the term racist, right? And it has become such a trigger word, and people appropriate that word for a variety of different reasons. But one of the pieces that I always find interesting is people's different definitions of racism, and you talk about racism versus prejudice.
Yes.
Can you just expound on that a little bit,
Sure.
given what we just talked about?
Well, in the opening of my book, chapter 1, now if you're reading the new version, which I encourage, the new version has a prologue, which reflects on the last 20 years, and then you get to chapter 1. But in chapter 1, I define terms. Because my purpose is to have productive conversations with people about this societal issue. And I think one of the things that gets in the way of productive conversations is that we use the same words, but we don't mean the same thing.
Yes.
And therefore, people are often talking past each other. So I know, when I put out my definitions, that not everybody's going to agree with me, but at least they're going to know what I'm talking about, right? So prejudice, we might describe as attitudes often based on stereotypes or limited information. It is possible to have a positive prejudice, right? I'm positively prejudiced toward, people who wear clothes like mine. I'm making that up. But, but generally speaking, we think of prejudice as a negative attitude towards some group or some group of people because of information we've learned about them, usually based in stereotypes. Many people use prejudice and racism interchangeably.
Yeah.
I, however, do not, and in the book I talk about why it's important to distinguish. Racism, if we reduce if we reduce racism to simply attitudes, you've got an attitude, I've got an attitude, that doesn't explain the systemic nature of racism and how it functions in our society to limit opportunity or grant access. So the definition of racism that I use actually comes from the work of a sociologist named David Wellman. He defined racism as a system of advantage based on race. And I think this is a very useful definition because it captures the way advantage is built into that racism system. Just like we could say sexism is a system of advantage based on one's gender assignment. We could say heterosexism is a system of advantage based on sexual orientation. Classism, a system of advantage based on socioeconomic status. There's a lot. Ableism, a system of advantage based on physical ability or intellectual ability. So racism, when we talk about racism as a system of advantage based on race, in the context of the United States, certainly, and in most places, we are talking about a system of advantage which advantages one group over another, and in the context of our society, white people over other people, people of color. And that doesn't mean that there aren't white people who are systematically disadvantaged by something else, right? You could be systematically disadvantaged by your poverty in a system of classism. You could be systematically disadvantaged because of your gender. You could be systematically disadvantaged because of your physical ability or your sexual orientation. But that doesn't erase the fact that you are systematically advantaged by your race if you're white.
So what's interesting is oftentimes what I have found is that the debate is about, how much time do we have left?
About a half an hour, we can start taking questions from the crowd.
Oh, okay, great. So one thing before we go to the crowd is for people who might not have fully read either edition yet, just a little sneak preview for those of us who've read the first edition and still need to read the second. Why are all the black kids sitting together?
Okay, so let me just say, if you're in an all-black environment, nobody is going to say, why are all the black kids sitting together, right? But if you are in a racially mixed environment, it is very common, if you're dealing with adolescents or older, to see that kind of grouping. Now, of course, if I walk into a racially mixed school and I see all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, I am also going to see white kids sitting together in the cafeteria.
Thank you.
Right? But nobody's going to ask that question. Right? Nobody's going to ask that question. But having said that, if you are growing up in a race-conscious society, which everyone here is, if you're growing up in a race-conscious society, when you get to be an adolescent, when you enter puberty typically, and you might say, well, why puberty? Because that's when your brain is changing, right? All that physical change is also changing the brain. And as the brain gets more sophisticated, the young person starts to ask more existential questions. Like, who am I? Who am I going to be in the future? What does my racial group membership mean? How do people see me? Am I being followed around at the mall? Do I hear the sounds of people's doors locking when I walk by? All of those things. The 6-year-old boy or girl is treated differently than the 16-year-old boy or girl, right? So as you get more, take on your adult form and more cognitively available thinking about these big existential questions, you naturally seek out people with a shared experience. Who else around me is asking that question? Who else around me is understanding what I'm going through. But I want to say this. It's not just that the kids are seeking themselves out to support one another. That kind of peer support is natural and useful. But there's also a way in which the lack of capacity, the lack of ability for white children to speak in a helpful way about the racism in the environment plays a role. And I'm going to give an example, and then we'll go to the questions. This is a true example from one of the experiences I had when I was working in those schools in Massachusetts. There was a black girl, 8th grade. So let's say in the 8th grade you're like 13. So you got this 13-year-old girl, and she goes to a racially mixed school. In the case of this particular school, she's being bused from Boston into a suburban school in a voluntary desegregation program. MECO, exactly. So she's a MECO student, which means she's participating in a voluntary desegregation program. She lives in a black neighborhood in Boston, but she's going to school in a mostly white suburban district, taking a bus there every day. And if you go to school that way, sometimes it's hard to participate in after-school activities because of the transportation issues. So in this particular case, we have a well-meaning, well-intentioned white male teacher who is talking to this girl about whether she's going to attend an after-school party, a dance. And she says she's not, and he's in his own way trying to encourage her participation because he wants all the kids to participate, and nothing wrong with that. But in the conversation, she keeps saying, no, I'm not coming. And finally, in frustration, he says to her, oh, come on, I know you people love to dance. Okay, that was some smog coming out, right? So he says that to her, she's offended. Now, she's still not coming, and now she's offended. So imagine this. That part's a true story. This is the part I'm imagining. Imagine now she is walking down the hall, and she's upset. And she sees her white friend, who she's been going to school with since she was kindergartner, right? They've known each other K through 8, they've been friends. And her white friend says to her, why are you so upset? And she tells her what happened. You know, I just had this conversation with Mr. Smith, not his real name, but I just had this conversation with Mr. Smith, and this is what he said to me. And her friend says, he didn't mean it, right? Or maybe she says, you're being oversensitive, right? Now,
I've got some flashback memories.
Right, okay. So I want everyone in this audience to think about being upset with your significant other. Imagine that. Just imagine. And imagine that you're upset with your significant other, and your significant other asks you what's wrong, and you say why you're upset, and that person says, you're being oversensitive. What happened to your mad meter? It just went up, right? So now, not only am I mad at Mr. Smith, I'm like, Susie doesn't get it, right? And so now imagine I keep going down the hallway, and I run into another Boston student, another black student from Boston, who sees that I'm upset. And that friend asks me what's wrong, and I tell her about the conversation with Mr. Smith. And she says, I can't believe he said that to you. He said the same thing to me yesterday. Now we're going to lunch together talking about Mr. Smith. And by the way, Susie didn't get it. I told her, you know. And so you can see how now we're sitting together in the cafeteria. But let's imagine a different scenario. Let's imagine Susie grew up in an environment where she learned how to talk about race. And let's imagine she understood stereotypes. And let's imagine she knew that if you breathe in some smog, sometimes you breathe some out. And let's imagine that our main character here has told Susie what happened, and Susie doesn't say any of the things we told her, you know, she doesn't say any of that. Maybe she says, I can't believe Mr. Smith said such a stereotypical thing to you. the two of them are going down the hall talking about Mr. Smith, right?
Yeah.
They're still sitting together in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
So some of that sitting together in the cafeteria is about connecting with people, having a shared experience, but it's also about avoiding people who don't get it.
Yeah.
And so, because it's too much time and energy.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
So it's now time for you all's questions. If you have questions, if you just raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Abby Nielsen. I absolutely love your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I've read it page to page, and I have so many things highlighted. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the goal-oriented affirmative action, because I think that's a big issue as far as when we're trying to have students see themselves represented K-12 and even on the college level, is that maybe white students have more faculty or staff that they can turn to and have as mentors, but then students of color are always left out, and there's like one faculty person who they can turn to for mentorship, and then that faculty person is overwhelmed, and then the excuse the administration gives a lot is that there just wasn't enough people. So if you could talk a little bit more about what you outlined as far as the goal.
Okay, so for people who haven't read the book yet, there is a chapter that talks about affirmative action and what it means and how it functions. And this was actually one of the chapters for people who read the 97 version of my book. This chapter had to be completely rewritten because some of the laws have changed, and 20 years later, the legal context has changed, so that had to really be updated. But one of the things I talk about is the distinction between process-oriented affirmative action and goal-oriented affirmative action. And so some people will say, we're going to have a fair process. We're going to advertise our jobs, and we're going to recruit people, and then we're going to interview whoever shows up, and then hopefully the best person will get the job. And sometimes that will be somebody from the majority that we've already hired from. Maybe sometimes that'll be someone who's underrepresented, but what we're going to focus on is making the process fair. What happens when people take that approach is usually not much, right? Because it's very difficult to make the process fair without acknowledging the role of implicit bias and the ways in which we make evaluative judgments about candidates. So I might think I'm a fair person, and think I'm perfectly capable of choosing the best person, but lo and behold, I keep hiring people who went to the same college I went to, right? And not recognizing the way familiarity is influencing my choices. If you have goal-oriented affirmative action, what you say is, we've got a goal, not to be confused with a quota, but we've got a goal of increasing our underrepresented faculty by X%. And so how are we going to do that? We're going to advertise widely, we're going to make sure our pool is diverse, and then we're going to set a threshold of excellence. And whoever meets that threshold of excellence is qualified. So it's not about more qualified, less qualified. It's like if you can, if this is the bar and you can jump over that bar, you're qualified. Now, some people are going to jump over the bar. I'm going to use a different analogy, swimming. If you can swim, I'm a swimmer, I like to swim for exercise. I can get from one end of the pool to another, I always do the crawl. Some people swim from one end to the other doing the backstroke. Some people swim doing the side stroke. But the question is, can you get from point A to point B? Recognizing I need someone who can get from point A to point B without drowning. That's what I'm looking for, right? And so if that's what I'm looking for, then the question is, if everyone in the pool can swim, then the question is, who in this pool of swimmers are going to help me achieve my goal, right? And then I'm going to choose, because they all can swim. They might not all swim the same way, but they all can, some people learn to swim in the lake, some people learn to swim at the golf club, but they all can swim. And now, who in this pool of swimmers helps me achieve my goal of diversifying my faculty? if you use that approach, you take out some of the ambiguity of evaluation that slips in if you're only focused on process and not outcome. I hope that's clear. But there's a lot more in the book about it.
Hi, good evening. My name is Devin Sutherland, and I just want to say that I purchased the book during my freshman year of college at the PWI, and I have to say that book helped me through my freshman year. So I was a Baltimore City Public Schools student, like K-12, went to University of Maryland, College Park. I was one of 2 black girls on my floor, and it was a complete culture shock for me at that school. I made it through, so I'm here, and I'm a parent of a wonderful 11-year-old, and I'm really involved in a lot of online groups around city schools, students, and parenting. One issue that we run into a lot are non-parents of color who get upset when we bring up topics of racism or possible racial bias in school selection. So I guess my question is, what advice do you have to parents who are not parents of color and decisions around examining their behaviors on school choice? Because I would imagine they don't want their children to be, guinea pigs or one of 2 if they chose to send their children to a predominantly black school.
So I would say, there's lots of good resources, but there's my current favorite resource for white parents in particular is a book called White Fragility. And it is written by Rodney D'Angelo, and it was and may still be on the New York Times bestseller list, but it's a very readable, very accessible book written by a white woman, whose name is Rodney D'Angelo, to white readers, which is not to say that other people can't read it. I read it, but her target audience are white adults, and she talks about the ways in which white adults both resist talking about racism and sort of melt. What is white fragility? Let me define that for you. She describes white fragility as a kind of lack of stamina, right? A lack of stamina when asked to talk about racism. So some of you will know what I mean by this. Sometimes when you're having interracial dialogue about race, and you're really talking about it in an honest and authentic way, and if you're a person of color and you're talking to a white person and you've had the experience of the white person starting to cry, raise your hand if that's happened to you. Okay. So if you've had that experience, that she talks about that experience and she describes it as white tears. And one of the things that she says about it is it's may not be a conscious strategy, but it is a strategy for stopping the conversation. Because usually what happens if you're in a group and the white person starts to cry is that people will turn to try to comfort the white person and close down the conversation. And that is a demonstration of a lack of stamina about, that let's get through a conversation with it. There's nothing wrong with showing emotion. I'm not trying to say that's a problem. But it is one of several behaviors that serve the purpose of shutting down conversations about race. And so if you find yourself uncomfortable in these conversations, if you're a white person and finding yourself uncomfortable in the conversations or feeling unpracticed, what I love about her analogy, her phrase calling it stamina, think about this. If you wanted to run a marathon or a 5K, if you wanted to run a 5K and you couldn't do it because you didn't have enough stamina, what would you do? Practice. You would run more, right? You would practice. If you don't have enough stamina to get through a conversation about race without breaking into tears, you need more practice, right? You need more practice. But I have found that white colleagues that I know have, I recommended a group of white women I knew to read this book, and they came back and said to me, thank you so much, it really opened my eyes. So I would encourage that, put that online.
Good evening, I'm Mary Alexander, and this is really hard to you guys, and at least any of the commissioners here, but Dr. Tatum, you talked about size matter, and you was talking about a preschooler. I was thinking about this 54-year-old here. I've always been tall. And this year, when I entered my grandson's school, his classroom, and I asked during Black History Month why they weren't having a particular comprehension lesson surrounding Black history. They were learning about George Washington. I said, why not George Washington Carver? They were learning about immigration and Ellis Island. And to not to belabor the point, there are some policies that we need to look at in the school system, because that one teacher took my, why isn't my grandson learning something about Black history and Black History Month as some kind of, she got a real defense with that. And so when I approached the principal and went to North Avenue, I later found out that there was a conversation about me and the policy to have parents or anybody in that school building removed who become a threat. Long story short, she worded it and framed it so that I became a threat because I stood up for my child's education. And when I went to board docs and I started looking at their policy about who can be removed from a building and who can be removed from a classroom, it was not supportive of me as someone who was an advocate. And the only thing that kept me, the principal, she nipped it in the bud. The only thing that I want to say saved me was my years of advocacy in the community, my years of serving on different boards and PTA, PCAP and stuff, so people knew who I was. But what about that parent who's working 2 jobs and nobody really knows who she is, and she's going to come up there and ask a similar question as to, my child, I want this on my child's education plate, and does that make me the angry Black woman because I said that? Or does that make me the concerned parent or grandparent in this case who's just asking a basic question, and then now I have to feel like I have to defend myself, and I have to look at these policies. So I would suggest that we look at the policies to, when you do have that uncomfortable conversation, that doesn't make you an ogre, that doesn't make you the bad guy, and that they can't use a policy to try to remove you from the conversation, just like those tears.
Well, I was just thinking about that when you were sharing your example, that's a great example of white fragility in motion. Absolutely.
Could I just say one thing on
this?
Yeah,
please.
Right? So I think one of the other pieces that your example points to is why we are beginning with our equity work to really begin, right, tackling some of these conversations, right, because we have not had them district-wide. Teachers haven't had the support, parents certainly haven't had the support, and I do think that within Baltimore's history of race, our particular context, race has been, at least since I've been in Baltimore City, it has not been directly discussed in relation to schools. Like it is not something that we have called out. We talk about equity generally, right? We reference it. We say this is a majority African-American system with growing numbers, by the way, of Latinx students, right? So we have avoided it. And I think your interaction, what's really interesting, is the number of emails or pull-asides, whether it's in Target or the supermarket, that I get that reflect your experience. So I just want you to know that. And I think that there is a piece for us re-examining the policy, but I will also say policy can only do so much, because we have had a number of policies that people will maneuver around if the root issue, right, of perception is not there. And just so you don't feel totally bad, I get that even in some boardrooms, right? So I mean, it is true for parents of color, but it is also true, there are times when I get energized because I'm passionate about something, and suddenly somebody's worried I'm going to take a swim, or, Dr. Santelises, you need to just calm down. It's not about all that, right? And you're absolutely right. Sometimes I wonder what happens with people who aren't sitting in the seat that I'm sitting in, actually try to present ideas, and because of uncommunicated privilege, folks try to shut that down. And so I just want you to know that that's consistent And it's part of why we're beginning a lot of the equity work that we are. It's why we have Dr. Tracy Durant with us, and why she won't just be a woman of one, but that we are building the capacity internally to be able to have these questions so you're not left just keeping it at a policy discussion. So I just wanted you to know that we are doing work in that area.
Great, thank you.
And I'm over here snapping at everything that you said, Dr. Santelises, because my question, and Dr. You as well. So this is a context for the day-to-day. I work with adults, mostly in private sector, around understanding cultural proficiency and bias and diversity, racial equity, right, fragility even. And I always wonder to myself, as a mom to a 2-year-old who happens to be really tall, what it would look like if we could get to folks before they're in boardrooms, if we could get to folks before they're in leadership roles. I encountered folks who have even talked about privilege or power or racial identity or bias even until they reach peak career. So I wonder, from y'all's perspective, what is the role of the education system and actually creating spaces where not just children and students are being exposed to some of these nuances and having a conversation, but then teachers are actually empowered and have the capacity to facilitate and curate those spaces in a way that are safe, right?
Yeah.
And not perpetuating some of the same dynamics that we experience as adults.
Great
Yeah.
question.
It is a great question, and I want to respond to it in this way. It's going to take a minute, if that's okay. So I want to respond to it by asking this audience a set of questions. Okay, and so I would like everyone in the audience to take a minute and think about your earliest race-related memory. Okay, raise your hand if you've thought of something. I'm not going to ask you to tell it. No risk here. Okay. All right, a lot of you thought of something. So now I want to know, how old were you at the time of the thing you remembered? And, okay, people are holding up hands. I see 3s, 5s, 4s, 6, 8, 7, a bunch of hands, 2. Okay, so I've got as young as 2, and I saw 8. Anybody older than 8? Maybe somebody had 2 hands up. 10. Anybody needed more hands than 2? Okay, so there's a range of ages, of course, and there's no right answer to this question, but somebody remembers something as early as 2, and at least 10, and some of you older than 10. But a lot of you had 5s and 6s and 7s, right? Raise your hand if you would say you were in elementary school at the time of your experience. Certainly the majority of you in elementary school. Okay, so now the question is, what is the emotion attached to that experience? You can call out words.
Frustration.
Frustration?
Anger.
Anger? Shock? Sadness?
Preparation.
Preparation? Curious? Confusion? So I'm going to repeat some. I didn't hear them all, but I heard confusion, I heard anger, I heard sadness, I heard shock. I think I might have heard shame. I'm not sure I heard that.
Yes.
I don't think I heard embarrassment, but sometimes I do hear that word. Confusion, certainly we heard. I'm leaving some out, but you get the gist. And these are, for most people, uncomfortable feelings. Somebody said curious, and that's sort of neutral. But for a lot of people, it's an uncomfortable feeling. So now the question is, raise your hand if you had a conversation with a concerned adult, a parent or a teacher, somebody like that, at the time that the incident occurred. Raise your hand. Okay, let's look around. All right, now raise your hand if you did not have that conversation. I think it's pretty clear there are more did not than did. And this is almost always true. I think, I really can't think of any time when there were more people who said they did. It's always the most say they did not. So some of you are familiar with 6 and 7-year-olds. Your own or somebody else's, right? And if you're familiar with 6 or 7-year-olds, see if you agree with this. They're pretty candid. They say what's on their minds. They don't filter much. And yet, here we have a room full of people, a lot of whom said, I was 6 or 7 when I had this experience. It was upsetting to me in a meaningful way. I still remember it now as an adult. I can raise my hand. But I didn't talk to anybody about it then. That's counterintuitive, right? Based on what we know about the chattiness of 6 and 7-year-olds. So why not? Why didn't you have those conversations?
Taboo.
Taboo. We learn early it's taboo, right? We learn early you're not supposed to talk about it. We learn early, imagine this, you're in the grocery store and you see, let's imagine you're a white parent with a white child, and that white child lives in a mostly white neighborhood. But now they're in the grocery store and there's a dark-skinned person in the store. And that, not just your dad. Why is mommy or daddy, why is that person so dark? What's that parent going to do? First thing. Absolutely. Shut that conversation down. And so, I use that example simply to say many people learn. It's not just the white people who learn that. Many people learn that this is a toxic topic. And we're not supposed to talk about it. Now, the question was, should we have these conversations with kids? We should. How do we have them? There's a lot in my book about how to have them. There's also a TEDx video, if you're interested, called Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk? Which is about how to talk to young children about race. But having said that, I don't know what you all do. Some of you are teachers. Some of you grew up and are leading organizations. But you all, what you have in common is that you all learned that you're not supposed to talk about it. And so then when you ask people to talk about it, I could say, yes, we should be having those conversations with kids. But if the teacher is struggling with her own fragility, that conversation's not going to happen, right? So you need to have some professional development to help people get comfortable with how to have the conversation. And just think about there are some great resources for preschoolers. One of the organizations I want to mention is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAEYC, which for 20 years has had a curriculum, an anti-bias curriculum, which talks about how to talk about isms with young children in an age-appropriate way. Louise German Sparks is one of the authors of that curriculum. That book came out in the 90s. I updated mine, and when I was updating mine, I looked to see if there was an update of hers. Lo and behold, a new 20th anniversary edition of that book, that anti-bias curriculum. But there are ways to have that conversation. When we talk about middle schoolers or high schoolers, I think about organizations like Facing History that provide great resources for having conversations about painful history and current affairs, current issues, like the shooting in New Zealand, Islamophobia and other kinds of issues. But if the teacher's not comfortable with the conversation, it's not going to happen. Even if the kids are talking about it, the teacher will shut the conversation down if she's not comfortable. So that's why the professional development is so important.
Two more quick ones.
Good evening. My name is Ann McAvoy, and I really appreciate both of your points tonight that you shared. I do a lot of the training and development for my company, and I recently joined the past year, and one of our core values, kind of our most important core values, is diversity. And our 2 leaders, one is a black man and a white man, have shown great strides in how we work together and do really great work. So my colleague and I are here tonight, and one of my biggest questions is we do a great job promoting diversity and hiring people, all different walks of life and color and backgrounds, and that's wonderful. But then there's the point about inclusion. So it's the idea you can put people together by multiple different hiring, or in the case of education, by busing to schools. But what does it take to really create advice that you live with to get out of that?
Well, I'm happy to speak to that. One of the things that I would say is that it does take effort, right? So one of the consequences of not going to school together, not growing up together, is a kind of social awkwardness, right? That can happen. So when we think about, there's a couple things I want to say. When we think about a work environment, or school environments for that matter, any kind of environment, there's often what I call the ABCs. I call it the ABCs. The A is affirming identity. That's the first thing. So imagine if there was a photographer up here taking a picture of all of you here tonight, and as you were leaving, you got a copy of that group shot. What is the first thing you're going to do when you get your copy of that photo? You're going to look for yourself. That is the only honest answer to that question. You're going to look for yourself. But let's imagine that picture was taken and you were digitally removed from it. So you get your copy, and yet you were there, you saw the flash go off, but you're not in the picture. You would wonder what's wrong with this picture, right? But let's imagine every time you come to these events, they take pictures, and every time they digitally remove you. Every time you get that photo, you're missing from it. You would start to say, not just what's wrong with this picture, what's wrong with me? Right, what's wrong with me? Am I invisible? How come I'm never in this picture? Why are they always taking me out? It would cause you to question your own legitimacy, your own identity. And so when we think about our environments, the first thing we have to ask is, who's missing from the picture? Right? Because everyone wants to see themselves in the photo. And if you're not in the photo, you're going to question either the organization or yourself. So for a productive work environment, you want people to feel aligned with the organization and feel like they're contributing something. They need to see themselves in the picture. So we have to think about what policies and practices do we need to put in place to make sure that people are included. If the policy and if the practice, it might not be the policy, but if the practice is that we always have our work social events, the holiday party, the whatever it is, we always have those work events at the local golf club. I'm making that up. And not all of us play golf. And maybe that golf club has a history of exclusion. And even if it doesn't still have a history of exclusion, it may feel uncomfortable to spend our time at the golf club looking at all those photos they've got about their exclusionary history, right? And so we might have to say, if we're going to be a truly inclusive organization, we need to find a place where we can have that important team-building experience in a place where everyone will feel comfortable. Or let's have a committee, a representative committee deciding, and if they decide they want to do something other than, the golf club activity, then we shouldn't say, but we always did that. Right? So that's the A. The B is about building community. The B is, when we talk about building community, I actually just gave an example, right? Having the group activity is a kind of building community, but it only works if the A has been covered, right? If we try to build a community without thinking about who's included, who's missing from the picture, we will have an event that reinforces the former exclusive structure and it's not inclusive. And then the C is cultivating leadership. How do people who haven't had much practice at the A and the B learn how to do it? What kinds of developmental experiences do we need to create so that people can learn how to connect across lines of difference? There are, multiple strategies, but I'm going to tell you one that comes from my experience as president of Spelman. When I won't name the company, but there was a company, organization, nationally known organization, wanting to recruit employees at Spelman College, wanting to increase the pipeline of black women going into their line of business. And that seemed great, but one of the things that organization struggled with is that they recruited people and they couldn't retain them. You know, there was like a revolving door. People came in and left. They didn't like it there. And so they were trying to figure out how to get past that revolving door, to encourage people to stay and feel like they were making progress and contributing and growing and thriving in that organization. But part of the challenge was that the people in charge of mentoring, that sort of mid-level management, those people, that was the group where there were very few black women. Very much, it was like a white male club, that group. And one of the people who worked there referred to it as the frozen middle. You know, like it was hard to get past the frozen middle because people were, you know, not used to giving advice. And anyway, so we came up with this idea that we would have what we call a mutual mentoring program, where students would be selected, Spelman students who were interested, would be interviewed and selected to like have summer internships. But part of the summer internship was not just for them to learn about this particular line of business, but for those mid-level managers to figure out how to engage with young 21st century black women, right? You know, that there would be some mutual learning taking place, and we called it mutual mentoring. So that is just one example, but we can think about, you know, what are some of the ways that we expand the limited experience of some of the decision makers so that they are better able.
Was it accepted? Were they receptive?
Yeah, they thought it was a great idea. I don't want to say it worked. But I want to say, because, you know, how do we know whether something's working, right?
Because the retention would go.
Right. But the reason I'm smiling here is because the organization, unfortunately, ran into some financial difficulties, right? But they thought it was a good idea, and I think it was a good idea in terms of the opportunity to exchange. So there were some things that went awry in this project that had to do with the organization.
All right. Now, I got one more question.
Okay.
All right. My question is about you brought up Michelle Alexander in the prison industry.
Yeah.
I'm an advocate here in Baltimore, and I got locked up for having a conversation about race and racism. I put a toilet in front of the Towson courthouse because the toilet don't care if you're black, white, straight, or gay. You know what I'm saying? It addresses racism. They tried to give me 20 years in prison for doing that. They tried me with terrorism. All right? Created like you say, casualty of war. I'm homeless now because of that. I can't get housing because of that. The repercussions behind activism and acting on these things. Like Martin and Malcolm. I'm a 60s baby. I was born in 59. Emmett Till was your Freddie Gray. You feel me? So to have these conversations today, we need to incorporate this in not just in these academic worlds. We need to have these town halls where people that it affects the most need to be in these rooms and have these conversations. You feel me? Because everybody in here is academically, you know, but it's affecting your kids, your grandkids, the people that are outside the door on the corner. So I applaud you in doing this, but we need more. And I'm going to give you a little information to make sure we do more. Okay? Mic check! That's how I am.
Well, I appreciate your comment. You know, of course, I don't live in Baltimore, but I think that this is a community that is ready for more conversation. There's no question about that.
Yes, absolutely. Are you taking more? You got it? Okay.
It's fast.
Okay.
My question is...
Okay.
Yeah, it is very ironic that my dad was raised 4 people ago and he kind of like on the other side. But
well, we
anyway.
have the balance. I do have to say there has been a kind of left side of the room.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment. We have these conversations about race and the impact of race. But for these conversations to be honest and truthful, it doesn't make much sense for the person who controls the power and the influence to have a conversation about relinquishing his power and control. Why would if I had the power and the control, why would I have a conversation with you about relinquishing my power and control?
Well, I have a response for that, what I'd be happy to share, which is to say, certainly there are people who would say exactly what you said. It's working for me, but here's the thing. Some people recognize that it's not working for them, right? That there's no such thing, this is no such thing as a free lunch, right? So the negative, racism is a system of advantage based on race, but people who are systematically advantaged by it are also paying a price for it. And that price comes from fear, that price comes from the anxiety that people are going to come after me and take my stuff. There are many examples we can offer, not just, a sense of moral indignation and outrage and, the spiritual cost of that. But, families that are separated from one another because of their internalized expressions of racism. There is a way in which we as a society, Dr. King would say, we've got a web of mutuality. And that what happens in one community inevitably impacts another community. And you might not see it right away, but it does. And so some people will say, I see it coming, I don't want it to be this way. Let me try to see if I can do it differently and work in coalition with others who want change. But you're absolutely right, there's some people who will say, and I've had students, I taught for many years a course on the psychology of racism in majority white institutions, and I had a white male student once who wrote, and at the end of the semester I learned a lot. I can see this is a problem, but it benefits me. I'm not sure I want to do anything about it. But having said that, he was one of a handful, I can count on one hand, students who had that kind of response. Most of them said, I want to make a change. How can I be better? How can I be a more effective change agent? And that's what gives me hope, knowing that there are people who want to be change agents, and are already, and some who are wanting to be more effective. I want to say one last thing, and then we're going to wrap.
Yes.
Which is, except for this guy's question. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to let you ask it. But this is what I wanted to say. Some of you will be thinking to yourselves, this was a really interesting conversation. I learned something. I wish there was somebody I know who really needed this conversation and wasn't here. You were preaching to the choir. Some people will say that. People often ask me, aren't you preaching to the choir? I like to say, the choir needs rehearsal. So think about how can I use what I've learned to be more effective in interrupting the cycle of racism. The more effective you are, the more people want to join you.
So really quickly, I went to a magnet school in Chicago, and I was one of the black kids sitting with a whole bunch of kids, some of them black, some of them others, at PWI, and I teach in Baltimore City Public Schools. So I'm wondering, I know sometimes our efforts come down to choices and priorities. So I'm wondering, in the scenario that you've made with the black kids sitting in the cafeteria, where do you focus your energies? But actually, this is a question for both of you. Do you focus on redesigning the cafeteria, or do you focus your efforts on making sure that those kids who haven't been eating properly can eat and eat well?
So let me say, there's nothing wrong with sitting together in the cafeteria. Right? So when the title of my book, Why Are All Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, it is that title because many people ask that question. It's not that title because I think there's something wrong with sitting together in the cafeteria, right? And even if you weren't worried about eating, right, and when you say, where do you put your priority? You know, do we worry about the social dynamics or the basic needs that kids, need met? Of course, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you got to start with the basics. Security, whether that's food security, shelter, etc. But I also want to say that even if we were doing everything perfectly, you still might have black kids sitting together in the cafeteria. Nothing wrong with that. The issue is I think, if we're talking about priorities, if I'm an educator in the building, unless there's some fight going on in the cafeteria, let them sit anywhere they want. The real question is, what's going on in the classroom? And if the classroom is giving kids an opportunity to engage meaningfully with one another across lines of difference, you won't see the same kind. I mean, you talked about that back in school where you were kind of mixing it up. That has everything to do with the culture of the school and what's happening in the classroom. And when you see that happening in the classroom, you see less of that kind of separation in the cafeteria.
I would just add.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would just add that I think the question's interesting within the context of Baltimore City, right, where we have probably a far greater number of schools that are actually not as diverse racially, right? So I think part of, and I don't know what you would call the bread and butter or the main thing, that piece. If we had more time, I'd ask you to expound a little bit. But I think for me, it is right now providing access, right, to high quality learning experiences, because that cuts across whatever the demographic schools are. And that for me has to be the main thing.
And the ecology,
Exactly. And to your point, and other folks might not have heard it, but your term, right, I love, right, the ecology of where we are, both as individual schools, as well as a system of many schools. And it's not that, and I will tell you, there are some heated discussions. Sitting in this seat, I get to see it from all corners of the city. And what it looks like, a discussion of this nature looks very different at a Douglas than it does at a Mount Washington or a Rockland, right? And so, but what that says to me, and this I do think is true, and this gets to the point of where most people are. Most people want high quality learning experiences for their kids, and they are more likely to try something that is unfamiliar to them with people that are unfamiliar to them if, right, at least we're hitting that bar of everybody swimming. I think the challenge we have currently that we're working on is issues of race sometimes get conflated or are able to be hidden in discussions of lack of access to quality learning experiences. And so to really hit it square on, we've got to make sure that we're building the quality learning experiences, but also knowing, like we went a long time and we didn't really talk explicitly about the implications of race, and I think we're doing that. But to me, that all goes out the window. I can't find somebody's bias if, to myself, I'm saying this classroom is one I wouldn't put my own children in. And so we have to be doing both, but we've got to get that quality learning. So I would like to first thank all of you for just providing kind of really rich feedback. I mean, even your, again, and I will just say from my tradition, the little shout outs and all that. Even though all of you could not speak, we heard you. So that was great. I want to thank again University of Baltimore for hosting us. Again, OSI for all of that, their work, and really helping this come to fruition. I do want to say a little footnote that when I talked about boardrooms, I didn't necessarily mean the city schools boardroom, because I get very energized board does not throw me out of it. So I just want that for clarity. And then finally, I want to thank, really, to me, the woman of the hour, Dr. Tatum, and thank you so much. All your work. You are amazing. You really are. At the university level, and this, I mean, no disrespect, there's some people you meet and you're like, wow, yeah, I wish I could just stay with your book. And then there are other people you meet and you're like, oh my God, your book doesn't even do you full justice. And you are in